Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. All attendees will be muted. We're going to run up until around about 8 o'clock, so about 1 hour. This webinar will be recorded. It will be made available after the event, so it will be put on YouTube, and we will send a link around for that for all those who have registered. At the end, there will be a survey. Please complete that survey, and that will help us improve our webinars for the future. So questions, we welcome questions throughout. If you'd like to ask a question, just use the orange box as you're instructed to do so. Pull that out, pop your question in. We've got James Haig working in the background tonight, who's going to triage those questions and send them through at the most appropriate time. Thank you very much. GB livestock are often quoted as being responsible for 7% of carbon emissions. Taken on its own, there are three fundamental issues with this statement. The first is it fails to recognise that farmers are being asked to manage and deliver multiple public goods. As well as producing nutritious and affordable food, they are asked to improve soil health and fertility, accelerate carbon sequestration, improve air and water quality, and optimise biodiversity. This is on top of the need to remain financially viable by making a profit. We shouldn't be quoting or looking at one of these elements without taking into consideration the other simultaneously. The second issue is that even for carbon, this is only looking at one side of the balance. Agreed policy targets of achieving net zero by 2050 should be precisely that, net. Talk of emissions only does not take into account the net element, and it does present AHDB with a challenge of evidencing GB's agriculture's carbon stocks. And thirdly, when looking solely at emissions, this number is based on a GWP 100 metric, where methane is weighted far higher than carbon dioxide in terms of warming potential. The United Nations has already recognized that GWP 100 is inaccurate when measuring the potential of methane warming. And we're looking at whether to approve another metric such as GWP star. We need practical solutions that dairy farmers can implement that allows them to start or continue to positively influence the environment whilst maintaining a profitable business and national food security. For this, we're working with Professor John Gilliland to establish a strategy that looks to address this. You'll hear more about this over the coming months. Today, we're talking about the tools and data that can start to provide practical and profitable options for farmers. And we're going to be talking to David Cotton from Bridge Farm in Glastonbury and Liz Bowles, CEO of Farm Carbon Toolkit, about the principles of carbon footprinting. Good evening and welcome both.
Good evening.
David, if we could start off, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, good evening everyone. David Cotton. I'm down here near Glastonbury. We've gone to completely autumn block calving 300 dairy cows, and we have 3 employees on the farm, and at the moment we just started drying everything off, and now we're hoping for another dry spell to start harvest as well.
Lovely. And David, you are one of our strategic farms. When did you sign up to be a strategic farm with us?
I think I must have signed up back in 2018, but I think we had our first meeting in 2019. I think it was, so it goes back a bit now. And yes, it was a decision taken really partly on the back of having been an AHDB dairy board member, as it was then, that it was an opportunity to say more about what AHDB does, as well as learn and benefit the farm here too.
Perfect. So it has been a bit of an awkward journey for you as a strategic farmer with COVID smack bang in the middle, but you have done quite a bit as part of the strategic farm program. Do you want to talk us a little bit through some of the journey that you've been along?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we started off, I think when we were first starting off, one of the discussions was obviously about the farm on the first one, and changing really from, we were using a diet of maize and looking at our transition cow diet as well. So we've actually, one of the hassles we have with maize here is the amount of starlings. So and they're eating what, a third of their body weight every day. So we were losing a lot of crop, and they were making such a mess. And I thought, well, I've got to get away from maize. So we had a discussion on that, and we've actually gone across to caustic wheat and rape meal now for the milking cows, and that works really well. So that's been a useful thing to do. And then after that, with the transition cows, we've now managed to get to the point that we've got the diet right for those. We actually tried a new product which seems to have made a big difference to not having any. We didn't have any milk fever cows at all last season, which is a real pleasing situation to get to, and that seemed to then lead on to actually getting better yields and getting them back in calf better. So all these things led in. So that was a useful thing. We did a session on soils, which actually feeds in quite well tonight because it's looking at organic matter and carbon structure of the soils. I'm conscious, and I think this tied in a bit with the maize too, is that we find that with the maize, we were destroying a lot of our soil structure. So actually, having done some work on with the soils discussion that we had, I've made quite significant differences to the way we cultivate our ground. So that's been a good one to do. The breeding side of it, we've done work on selecting bulls and on getting the best out of our herd, and that was really useful with Keith Goo. And then we did one on succession, and actually the succession plan is falling into place now, with Emma, our eldest daughter, going to take over when I get to 65, which is 3 years time. So at that point she'll be taking over from me, and I shall take a step back and move to the farm that I think when we first started this journey we just bought Withiel Farm next door, and we'll be moving up to that farmhouse in 3 years time. So that's the plan there. We then had a real good session actually talking about the beef from the dairy herd, and it confirmed to me that the best time really to sell our store cattle is probably anywhere April, May time, when they come out of a second winter. And this year it was the perfect example. We sold them at early May, and the prices peaked at £1,290 for some of those steers that came with the Aberdeen Angus's. So it was the right thing to do, because if I put them back out to grass, they would have lost some weight and lost some condition, and we wouldn't have got those prices. So we actually had a fantastic benefit from doing the presentation, from going through the exercise with Andy Dodd on that, and then seeing the end result. So that's been a really good one. And then tonight we're on demystifying carbon.
Fantastic. That was a very comprehensive overview of what you've done. If anybody would like a little bit more information on any of those topics, then you can visit our website, go onto the Strategic Farm page, and if you go on to, unfortunately, you're now going to be registered as a past Strategic Farm because this is your last session with us. But if you go into that area on the farm, then we can bring up Bridge Farm and go through all of those outputs that we've had from you. But as your final event, why have you chosen to cover carbon? What's your particular interest in recapping everything, framing it around carbon?
Well, I suppose there's a number of reasons behind that. It probably started as an Isle of Farmer, where we were doing we were having carbon audits done quite a while ago, and so that was the start of it. And then I've now got involved with the dairy roadmap, along with Dairy UK, the NFU, and AHDB, and we're very much looking at the whole thing about carbon and carbon toolkits and measuring carbon, and so and getting some standardization across the industry to make it work best for the dairy farmers to trust the figures on it. So that was some of my basis for going down that road. But I think also from doing that, I've learned that actually with carbon, if you run your business well and efficiently, you'll have a better carbon footprint. And I think that's some of the way I look at it, is that we can do what we can, but we've still got to farm, we've still got to produce food, and at the end of the day we will keep looking for improvements. And I just thought it was an opportunity to discuss this further.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And we're very fortunate tonight to have Liz Bowles join us as well. So Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. Tom, and really brilliant to hear David's sort of comments about why he's chosen carbon this evening. So I'm Liz Bowles. As Tom said, I'm the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a relatively small organisation. We were set up by farmers, for farmers, over 12 years ago now, with the sole aim really of helping farmers to understand more about greenhouse gas emissions and what they could do to reduce them, and whilst storing more carbon in soils and trees and hedges, alongside being profitable, viable, nature-friendly farms. And we're still doing that 12 years later. And I'm really pleased to be here this evening just talking to you about it. And I'm very happy if people want to put questions into the chat to answer them as we go along. And very much this evening's talk is about just that, demystifying carbon. And I was lucky enough a few weeks ago to meet up with David and Tom on farm. So I'm using David's farm really as an example of what David's doing to reduce his emissions. And I imagine when he started off as a strategic farm, he wasn't really thinking so much about carbon as he is now. So it's quite interesting to frame it in that way now. So can we just have the first slide, please? So I'm just, yeah, that's fine. So first of all, I just wanted to do some of the basics, and Tom's kind of covered this already by talking about the sort of stat that apparently cows are responsible for 7% of the methane produced. But I wanted to start off by a really basic slide which looks at, what are greenhouse gases? And I'm sure probably, as you're all dairy farmers, my guess is you probably know by now, because your milk buyers will have asked you to do a carbon footprint, or at least an emissions footprint. So methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide are the three gases we're talking about. And you can see the next line down. UK agriculture is responsible for 11% of total UK emissions. And I must admit, whenever I'm in meetings with journalists or people from some NGOs, I like to ask them, I don't show them this first, I ask them, what do you think the emissions from UK agriculture are as a percentage of total UK emissions? And I can more or less guarantee that I'll get a number from 25 to 35%. What they're quoting is the total emissions from our food systems all the way through to our fridges, and including the waste, the food we don't eat. And when I tell them it's 11%, they're very surprised that it's such a small number. And I suspect the general population would be fairly surprised too. And as David said a minute ago, actually, greenhouse gas efficient businesses are generally efficient and profitable. So the two are really closely linked. But agriculture is probably one of the most complicated areas to look at in terms of greenhouse gas footprinting, because it relies on biological systems, and that's why no one size fits all. And just to sort of draw your attention to the pie chart on the right of the graph, you can see that the three gases that come from agriculture, methane is by far the largest one in yellow, with nitrous oxide in blue, and then carbon dioxide in green. So compared to the general run of greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture is producing far more methane than carbon dioxide, and in that regard it is responsible for a lot of methane emissions. And I'll talk a bit more about GWP star a bit later on. But I was pleased, Tom, to hear your statement that you read out right at the start, because it's an area where there's been a lot of discussion about how we should account for methane. And I think we at Farm Carbon Toolkit really welcome the fact that AHDB is considering how they deal with this going forward. So if we just move on, please, James. Yeah, just wanted to show you how different the emissions are from arable farms compared to ruminant livestock farms. And you can see on arable farms, the majority of emissions come from fertilizer production and application, alongside then fuel use and field operations. And by that we mean losses from soil through field operations. By contrast, in ruminant farms, just about 50% is coming from the livestock themselves. And then quite a lot coming from manures, that's both methane and nitrous oxide, but quite a lot, if you look at that green bit, coming from imported feedstuffs. And we'll come on to that later, because certainly there's been a lot of focus on how to remove soya from livestock diets, and probably for dairy cows that's not such a big issue, but it is for some other livestock classes. So now we'll move on to, yeah.
Liz, just before we move on from that slide, we've got
Sure.
a question that's come in, which I think might be suitable now.
Yeah,
So
go for it.
we're looking at two different farming systems there in terms of ruminant livestock and arable, but could we break down ruminant livestock farms into intensive and extensive, such as a house system or a grazing system in a dairy scenario?
Yes, I mean, you definitely.
Most efficient system in terms of carbon in that respect?
Oh, that's a very good question. God, they were really in there very, very quickly. It's down, I think, to intensity at that point, because when you've got a house system, it's also linked to yield. And I would say that if you're looking at an extensive system, the balance will be slightly different, because potentially there'll be less fertilizer going on. So you'll be seeing less emissions coming from fertilizer. The emissions from the animals themselves will be fairly constant, given the calculators we currently use. And this is a real kind of bit of a health warning, that currently some of the emissions factors are quite a blunt instrument, and there's an awful lot more we need to do to better understand the real impact. For instance, where livestock are out grazing, we don't really understand enough about the fate of the methane those livestock are emitting when they're grazing. Does it, because it's quite a heavy gas, does it go back into the soil more quickly than when livestock are on concrete, for instance? I'm not going to actually give an answer, because you have to take it in the round to also look at carbon storage in soil, and there's a different impact potentially in terms of carbon storage in soil where livestock are grazing compared to systems, for instance, where livestock are in all the time and forage is being predominantly cut rather than grazed. So I think probably when we come to we can talk about it a bit later, because it's a real issue, and I know it's the one where sometimes dairy farmers would like to choose the calculator that they're measured by, because some calculators at the moment will give them, they feel, a better result than others depending on their farming system. And I think in a way that also links to what David was talking about earlier with the work that Dairy UK is doing. And certainly we're working very closely with David and his team on that, because we're very conscious that all farmers need to be able to use calculators that they trust, and that if they do give them different answers, they understand why. And there are good reasons why different calculators do give different answers, but the reasons aren't well enough understood, I would say, at the moment. Okay, look, I'll move on if I may, but yeah, I hope I didn't duck it too much. So what I've done with the next few slides, and this is something when we're doing farm carbon footprinting for farmers, we talk about the hotspots. We talk about those areas where the greatest intensity of emissions are coming from. And for dairy farms typically, and for many farms actually, livestock farms, those three big areas tend to be fuel, fertilizer and feed. We call them the 3 Fs. So I'm going to sort of talk about that, framing it with David's farm. And as I say, I visited a few weeks ago and I've got a few pictures to illustrate it. But what I wanted to share with you first was these came from some sort of typical KPI costings that David shared with me. And you can see the increase in yield that's occurred on his farm over the last 5-6 years. So it's gone up by about 1,100 litres per cow. But what's interesting is during, quite perversely really, milk from forage has also gone up, which is quite unusual, although stocking rate's gone down. So you could imagine that potentially there's a relationship there, but it's really, I would say, very good to see milk from forage going up alongside yield increasing, and it suggests there's something going on there in terms of improved grassland management, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. His concentrates fed per litre have gone up, not surprisingly. And I did ask David quite a lot about his fertilizer usage, and I think we got to the point of him agreeing that he'd reduced his fertilizer usage by something like 28 tonnes, which is actually significant, and we'll see in a minute just how significant that is. And David no longer uses any P and K fertilizers because his indices are high enough. And I think that's definitely an area which not only saves emissions, but saves quite a lot of cost, where you're checking your soils regularly and you can see that your P&K indices are good enough and you don't need to boost them further. So firstly, then if we move on a slide, we'll look at the fuel side of it. I think that's what's coming up next. Yeah, and I called it energy, but really it's electric, it's diesel, it's heating oil, it's all those sources basically that tend to be either reliant on fossil fuels, or in the case of electricity, increasingly now electric is coming from renewable sources, but not all. So you can see here 3 innovations that David has put onto his farm in the last 5 years. They're all about reducing the usage of electricity, and given what happened last year, it's not really surprising why he's done it, although David started a number of years ago. So solar PV, he's got a significant amount now on his roofs. This one I found interesting was, because I'm afraid I've been out of dairying for a while. I used to be a dairy advisor with ADAS many years ago. Was this introduction of vari-speed vacuum pump, which not only reduces the electricity required to run the parlour, but it also is quieter, which strikes me as a very good innovation. And the third one is this glycol milk cooler, which cools milk much more quickly, so the compressor isn't working as much. And alongside these innovations on electricity, I wanted to also mention some of the work that's going on. And in fact, it was on the Farming Today programme this morning. I think there was somebody talking about a Case New Holland tractor running on biomethane. Well, in many instances, that biomethane is coming from slurry stores. And at FCT, we're involved in a project in Cornwall, where one of the first such sets of equipment has been set up on a Duchy of Cornwall farm. Actually, no, it's not. It's a Cornwall County Council farm. And effectively what it is a lid over the slurry store. The methane is then collected, liquefied, and turned into liquid fuel for either farm machinery or sold. And in the case of Cornwall, it goes to Cornwall County Council's waste picking up fleet. And actually, I think this has got huge potential for dairy farms, especially when by 2027 all slurry stores are going to have to be covered anyway. Okay, let's move on to look at fertilizer next. Thanks, James. So this one, massive source of emissions on arable farms, not so big on livestock farms, but still significant, especially where fertilizers based on fossil fuels are being used. And I've just really captured a few pictures here just to remind myself of the importance of maximising the benefit of slurry through managing it well and applying it as really applying it when the soil needs it and when the crop needs it, rather than when you need to get rid of it. And David, on this one, I noted down that you now put on your slurry through an umbilical or a dribble bar, and that you kind of are putting on little and often rather than going on with big slugs.
Yeah, that's generally the case. If we can work it right to get it after every silage cut, and sometimes after a grazing round as well. I mean, one of the challenges with our grazing rounds at the moment is that Arla won't let us use great fields for grazing until 4 weeks after slurry has been applied, whereas usually we try and do it on a 21-day rotation for grazing, so that can be a challenge. But certainly where we can use the dribble bar and get it straight down on the soil is much better thing to do.
Yeah, and do you think that's had something to do with the fact that you've managed to reduce your fertilizer purchases?
I think it's certainly helped. I mean, obviously the dry summers have made a difference to that as well, because actually what we seem to find happens is that you get after a long dry spell, you certainly get a boost in grazing, which seems to come from the nitrogen being released into the soil without having to put any fertilizer on. So I think that helps too. And so if we can put a bit of slurry on, then with that, even that little bit of moisture makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's interesting because I mean certainly the amount of fertilizer you've managed to save is significant, and you've not seen any disbenefit in terms of milk from forage, which is really commendable. Okay, if we move on then, please, James. Sorry, go on.
That's why we have had a question come in. David, do you get your slurry analysed?
No, I don't. It's one of those things I'm guilty of at the moment, and it's partly because I'm never quite sure how much water there is in it every time, and I think I'm going to have to start analysing it. It's one of those things where I think if it was one of those quick, simple bits of kit that I could literally go out, take an analysis and say, yeah, there's the answer, that's where I'd like to get to. Is there some kit around like that now? I'm not sure if there is yet, but if we could get to that point that we can do on-farm analysis and get a result that we can trust and say, right, there's that much nitrogen gone out in the slurry, then that'll make a big difference to me.
Interesting. You need a version of the crap app, don't you?
Yeah, one that actually, because I never quite sure, because of the amount of rainfall that goes into that slurry pit.
Yeah.
I'm never quite sure how dilute it is, and that's the thing. So that's my challenge.
Yeah.
Well, there is a clip on AHDB YouTube channel of how to take a slurry sample.
Good. Okay, let's moving swiftly on. Let's move on to feed, please, James. Thank you. So this is the third of the 3S, the big sources of emissions on livestock farms. And if you remember, David, although his yields have gone up by about 1,100 litres, concentrate usage has moved up by only 0.02 kilograms a litre. And I think the big thing that I picked up from David when I visited was his grazing management. So cows go out onto a new paddock after every milking, and that means cows don't come back round and they're not spending very much time on each paddock, and they return only after quite a long time, and that gives the grass time to recover. That really helps to keep carbon in the soil, because certainly where grass is being grazed over a longer period of time, they're finding out that more carbon is being lost. And the other big thing, which David already has taken soybean meal out of the concentrates he feeds to his cows, but that can reduce emissions per litre quite significantly if you had a fairly high level of inclusion of soybean meal in your feed and then you take it out. So that's something really to start talking to, if you're buying in concentrate feeds, to talk to your feed manufacturer about, because they'll only change that if there's enough pressure from farmers and from your customers, but it's starting to happen. And I'm just going to give very quickly, I feel a bit guilty doing this, Tom, but there's a new project which has just started, funded by Innovate UK, which is being led by the Pea Growers Research Organisation, and we're involved in it, looking at how best to really increase the production of peas and beans in the UK on arable farms, and also how best to support livestock farmers to include those peas and beans in livestock diets, which I think will be quite, if we could just do that, moving say 20% of the feedstuffs to be non-soya, it would make such a big difference in the UK to our overall footprint.
Liz,
Yep.
I was having a chat with my feed merchant the other day. Do you feel guilty, or is it wrong to use soybean hulls? Because at the end of the day, the hulls are, the beans would have been used somewhere else, and the hulls are left over as waste. So where do they fit into the scheme of things, do you think? It's one of those challenges, isn't it?
It's a real chicken and egg, because within the calculator we have to assign a proportion of the emissions from deforestation to soybean meal, and then another proportion of it goes to soybean oil that goes into human food consumption, or human food ingredients. And I think that the problem will be if we can't reduce the overall demand for soya in all its guises. And actually, quite frankly, personally, I would say that we could find alternatives to soya in human diets as well. I well remember when soya first started to become fashionable was probably in the late 70s, early 80s. Prior to that, not a great deal of soybean meal came into the UK. And the reason, it's a great feed, it's a fantastic feed. The problem is the associated deforestation that comes with it. If we could only buy soya from ground that hadn't been deforested in the last 20 years and not encourage more ground to be more trees, more rainforest to be felled, then fair enough. But at the moment, I think it's more the signal it sends. And I would imagine soybean hulls would be a highly fibrous feed. I actually don't know much about them in terms of their nutrient content, but they'd certainly be high in fiber, I'd imagine. Yeah. Okay, should we move on to the next slide? Because I'm sort of conscious that, I mean, it's great to have questions coming in, because I think this is the really valuable part of the evening, to be honest. So what I've done here is I've just literally listed some of the things we take into account when we're calculating a farm carbon footprint and the emissions associated with these things. So the first one is a tractor. It's a big number, and it's the emissions associated with producing a tractor. And what we do in our calculator, not all calculators do this, so again, this will be a source of some of the differences. We will, where as a farmer you've invested in machinery or buildings or whatever it is, we assign what we call an embedded emissions factor to those things, and we depreciate them over 10 years. So once they're 10 years old, they come off your footprint. The reason we do that is that tractor wouldn't have been produced if you as a farmer didn't want to buy it. And there are emissions associated with its production, and they have to be counted somewhere. So we include them in your footprint. And then you can see below that one dairy cow, 4.7 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So basically she's a tenth of a tractor. And you can go on down through and see the different levels of emissions that are in calculators associated with different inputs. And 10 tons of concrete is a ton of carbon. It's not really surprising, because there's an awful lot of energy required to make concrete. So again, all these things need to be accounted for. And this just gives you an idea of some of the numbers that sit inside the calculators that have been used to calculate your emissions. Thanks, James. Yeah, now this was something that David wanted me to cover, and I'll come on to it later in more detail, because and also Tom did ask me the question, can dairy farmers get to net zero? And certainly through producing milk, there are emissions associated with it. But, and this is the big but, you can see here all the things that are also going on your farm, which are storing carbon either in soils or in hedges and trees. And I put by far the biggest one at the top of this list. So what this is saying is that for every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter that you manage to achieve per year, it's equivalent to nearly 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. That's huge. For those of you who've actually done a farm carbon footprint, you'll see in a minute the kind of likely tonnages that come from a dairy farm in terms of emissions. That's only 0.1% increase in soil organic matter. And you think so much of our soils are degraded in terms of their carbon content, even on dairy farms, I would say, sometimes more due to compaction than other reasons, but certainly there's huge scope to improve the levels of soil carbon, and that's what it's doing in terms of taking carbon out of the air. The other one I wanted to draw your attention to was the difference between leaving your hedges to have long growth versus trimming them. And I've got two examples here. They're not actually from the same field, although they do look quite similar. The top one is where where the hedge is being kind of given a really short back and sides. And the bottom one is actually one of my fields, and it's been left. That's 3 years of growth. And actually that was taken a year ago, and it's even bigger this year. So the different, you can see, I mean, both hedges are perfectly serviceable in terms of being a barrier, and they're not ridiculously overgrown, but it's actually storing a lot more carbon. And the other one is, the one I would say though about trees, and it's something to bear in mind, is that in their first 10 years of life, trees aren't storing that much carbon. It's only when they get into their teenage years where they've got a bit of girth about them that they really will be storing carbon. And what we do within our calculator, if you've got woodland and you put it in and you tell us what kind of you've got, we'll use the woodland carbon code to estimate the likely storage of carbon that you're achieving, because you'll have to tell us how old your trees are. Okay, let's move on then. Thanks, James. So this slide just summarizes it really in terms of, as a farmer, you've got your sources of emissions and you've got your sources of sequestration. those emissions are coming from your feed, your fertilizer, your fuels, your other inputs, your capital investment, and your waste. Then if you take away the sources of sequestration of getting carbon onto your farmland through trees, through hedges, and into soils, probably mostly into soils, if I'm honest, on functioning farms, that gives you your carbon balance. And that's what we produce at with our farm carbon calculator. Some other calculators don't actually, what they produce for the farmer is an emissions per kilogram of output, but they're not measuring sequestration at all. And again, that's another source of difference between calculators, because some are providing a balance, others aren't. Okay, have we got any more questions, Tom, or shall I move on?
Not just at the moment. If you could.
That's absolutely fine. Let's move on then. So now what I wanted to do was just to move into talking a bit more actually about the process of carbon accounting. I think I've already covered some of it, but I think that the thing I would say is that if you don't know what your current numbers are, it's less easy to know where to focus. And it is that vital first step to be able to quantify the contribution that your farm is making to climate change, actually. And sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised. I shall never forget when she was actually a beef farmer, but she'd got quite a lot of woodland, and she did a farm carbon footprint with us. And to find out that she was already better than zero was, she was absolutely delighted. And sometimes you can get a pleasant surprise as well as a less pleasant surprise. And all the carbon footprint calculators will identify the quantity and sources of those 3 key greenhouse gases that are coming from farm. And most of them will sort of highlight areas where you could potentially make changes. And I think the most important thing to say about it is once you've got your baseline, you can then start to think about what you can do about it. If you haven't got your baseline, it's much more difficult to actually even know where to go first. And as David was mentioning, this need to make sure the metrics that you are collecting and measuring, they've got to be relevant and practical to you as a farmer. And that's why it's so important to understand what they're telling you. And that's sometimes I get a bit annoyed when I see just numbers being sent to farmers with no kind of context behind them, because it's really hard to know what to do if you just get a number. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, and this was, I was just going to talk through with you, and James, in a minute I'll ask you to move on a bit quicker, because I've done one of these wonderful things where I've given it some a bit of animation. So calculating a carbon footprint, this is what is going on inside these wonderful calculation engines, which basically have got loads and loads of formulae multiplying things by each other. So for something relatively simple like fuel, we simply need to know how much fuel you've used, and then there's an emission factor for diesel which has been agreed by the IPCC, which will be used by all the calculators, and then the number of litres is multiplied by the emission factor, and that will give you the emissions associated with that amount of diesel. So if you click 3 times, James, that'll be brilliant. And again, and again. I don't know why I did it in 3 goes. So for instance, if your farmers, you've used 10,000 litres of diesel, that's the emission factor in the middle, which is the one we saw a couple of slides ago. So if you use 10,000 litres of diesel in a year, you will be emitting 34 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. That is the straight calculation. That's how it's done. Then if we move on to the next slide, we'll see something a bit more complicated. And this is actually probably one of the most complicated things within all the calculators, which is to properly account for all the emissions from especially from ruminants, but from livestock. I mean, it looks fairly simple on the face of it. We just need to know how many cattle you've got. But all the different classes of cattle, both breed, age, even sex, have different emissions factors. And if you want your report to be as accurate as it can be, just telling us how many cattle you've got is not enough. You need to be splitting them into different age groups, different sexes, And that almost means, and I know some of my team, they will literally kind of do a tally month by month to see when cattle move from one group to the next. And that's probably the most accurate way of doing it, to give you the most accurate footprint for your herd. And it is important because, as we saw right at the start, 50% of emissions on a livestock farm are associated with methane from those animals themselves. Okay.
Liz, you've got
Yep.
age down. Does that also account for age at first calving?
It's the age of the animal. And this is something I don't know if we've got Becky on the call, but certainly it was something that I wasn't fully aware of until I had it explained to me, that different, say, females and males have different emissions factors at the same age. So it's really important to make that differentiation. What we've got in our calculator just a few months ago, we improved the segregation of different classes of cattle to make it easier for farmers to put them into the different categories, and B, just make it more accurate as well. So I mean, at the moment we've got cows calving up to 24 months is one category, and obviously if your cows are calving at more than 24 months, it will be picked up by the larger number of animals you've got in the follower group. But what
it is also it's an efficiency thing as well, though, isn't it, Liz?
Yeah,
so,
of course it is.
So you've got that as an efficiency, is the 24-month calving. So, and also the replacement rate then comes into it as well. So there are different factors that come in. But as you say, that if they're calving at an older age, then you'll have a larger follower group of older animals as well. So it sort of gets at it twice, doesn't it?
It does. It will be accounted for. But what I would say, though, at the moment, no calculator, and it's something that has been identified in the most recent guidance that's been issued, is that all calculators need to better account for the embedded carbon when farmers buy in replacement livestock. Because at the moment, that where you're looking at, well, no calculator currently does that, and we do need to come to an agreement nationally as to what those numbers should be and then apply them, because otherwise farmers who are have their own breed their own replacements are actually look worse than farms that buy them in. Okay. And that I think also sort of points to the fact that these are estimates, and rather than being absolute numbers, but they are getting better, and that's what I would say. And that increasingly what we're doing when new products come along, we're putting them onto our calculator to help farmers who are using these products, or indeed who are carrying out practices which we know will make a difference, because all calculators need to properly reflect those reductions in emissions because of the practices or because of the products that farmers are using. And at the moment they don't always, but they're getting better. Okay.
Liz, we have had a couple of other questions come in.
Yep.
Will dairy milk buyers be asking about your carbon footprint soon? Will they pay more for low or neutral producers?
I didn't quite hear the weasel word in the first part of the question. It was, can you say it again? Sorry, Tom.
So will dairy milk buyers be asking about your carbon footprint soon?
Yes is the answer, I'm sure. I'm a lamb producer. I shan't say who I sell my lambs to, but every year they send out, they ask me to complete a survey online. And this year, for the first time, they asked me if I'd carried out a farm carbon footprint, and if so, who was it with and what was the answer? So yes, I think it's because the reason being that either the retailer will have made commitments, or indeed the milk buyer may have made commitments under the Science Based Targets initiative to get to net zero by a certain date. And that means they need to look at not just their emissions within their direct control, but also at their scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And I think when many of these businesses made these commitments, it was at a time before they properly understood what they were doing. Because, for instance, probably 70% of the emissions certainly for retailers, will be at scope 3 on farm with farmers.
And
So
I think
if
most of the milk buyers now are looking at setting up carbon footprint teams or teams looking at that side of it as well, and whether it's getting people in to assess the data or asking the farmers to do it, it depends on each milk buyer, but there's certainly more and more of them now are doing it.
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely they are, and it's that's the reason. And then I think the another question which we'll come on to if we've got time is to do with offsetting or insetting, because increasingly retailers are talking about wanting to inset those rather than buy offsets, which I think again farmers need to think about that a lot. Tom, you said that was there another question, or shall we move on?
Let's
there
move
was
on.
a second part.
I think we're going to get to that topic as we get there. So
okay, let's carry on. Okay, GWP star. I mean, I think to be fair, I think Tom's probably said most of it, but it's interesting. We did include it on our calculator and then we took it off, mainly because at that time it wasn't considered to be the right thing to do. And I mean, Tom, you're right. If we apply GWP star, it will generally reduce emissions. We won't actually reduce the emissions themselves, but the numbers will be lower. And the reason being that methane is a relatively short-lived greenhouse gas. So the greenhouse gases, methane 12 years, carbon dioxide 100 years in the atmosphere, nitrous oxide 121 years in the atmosphere. So what initially had been done was all the greenhouse gases were sort of standardized on 100 years, which didn't make methane look very good. But, and this is important, if you move to GWP star, then yes, green methane, its impact as a warming, its warming potential will drop very quickly, but it will be much higher initially, and that's relevant if you're increasing livestock numbers. It's not relevant where you've got a stable livestock unit or if you're reducing livestock numbers, but if you're increasing livestock numbers, it will give you a bigger hit initially, because methane is a potent greenhouse gas, but it doesn't hang around as long. That's the point, and then it gets broken down into carbon dioxide.
But this is where some of the irony in all these discussions is the fact that the national herd has shrunk significantly, hasn't it, over a period of time, and the efficiency of that herd as well. So
yeah.
it will probably still keep shrinking, but it's one of those things that is the sort of the balance of livestock numbers has gone down technically.
Yes, and I mean, and if you think about this, this is all being looked at on a global basis rather than on a national basis, and globally ruminant numbers are rising as other parts of the world want to eat meat and drink milk. That's not happening in the UK, and I think that's also why AHDB is reviewing its position, and so is the NFU, because potentially what's happening really is that it's about reducing emissions now. That's the point. And if we were to move to GWP star, then actually it would help reduce the emissions from UK agriculture, so long as we're not increasing livestock numbers. So potentially that would make us look better. I mean, it won't actually reduce the amount of emissions that are happening. It's how we measure it, and then the relativity of it in terms of what needs to happen. That's the significance of GWP star, because it changes what you focus on. But really, and this is the thing that I can't stress enough, that the biggest contributor to climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. That is bringing new product into the world and releasing carbon dioxide. By comparison, what ruminants are doing is cycling methane that's already here, and that's critical really to grab hold of, which is why it's so important that we find ways to replace fossil fuels, probably more important than finding ways to replace ruminants, I would say. But at the moment, the current net zero policy is that we'll carry on using GWP 100 until 2027, unless, Tom, at the AHDB, you can bring some pressure to bear on that one. But that's probably something that needs to be sorted out by the Climate Change Committee in the UK. Okay, let's move on. Oh gosh, I'm conscious I'm running out of time as well. So this is just giving us an example report. It's actually a dairy farm. And I've said most of this, so I'm not going to repeat it, but it's quite interesting to look. So this is a dairy farm, and I don't know whether you can even read the numbers. I can't read them actually on the screen, but you've got there something like 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being emitted from this farm. But then there's something like, I think it's 1,100 tons of carbon being sequestered. Actually, it must be 3,000 tons being emitted, 1,100 tons being sequestered. So a net emission of 1,300 tons. And that's kind of the kind of thing we see on quite a lot of dairy farms. And that offset or sequestration is coming about from hedges, trees, and renewable energy. So you can see the kind of, therefore, for that business to get that yellow bar down to nothing, they need to either reduce emissions by 1,300 tons or increase sequestration. And my guess is it'll be a combination of both.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on again, because I do want to leave a bit of time for a bit of general chat. This just shows you for the same farm, the split of those emissions and the split of the sequestration. So you can see livestock, ruminants, the biggest source of emissions on dairy farms. I have to say this is a dairy farm where they're predominantly forage based, so that you can see this, the emissions coming from other inputs are relatively low because they're not using them. But still, whatever you do, a cow will emit methane. You can reduce it. I mean, these methane inhibitor products, they're coming along. The latest one, I think this week, was daffodils, which sounds interesting. It's interesting, about 20 years ago, they were looking at daffodil extracts to combat Alzheimer's. Now they're looking at it to reduce methane emissions. But you can't really get away from the fundamental fact that a cow is a ruminant and methane is a byproduct of ruminant digestion. So, I think that is inescapable. Okay, let's move on. I think I've just got a few more slides left, and then so this is the bit I wanted to end with, which is farming's unique role, really, which is about our ability to store carbon in soil. Just last Monday, I attended a meeting to do with all of these fancy ways that are being looked at to remove carbon from the air. Things like carbon capture and storage, things like enhanced rock weathering, biochar, which are all coming along, but they aren't there yet. They've still got lots of research to do. But by comparison, we know that we can store carbon in soil and in trees and hedges. We know that. We don't need any real, we don't need a lot of research. Yes, we could probably do some research to work out how to do it quicker, what farming practices we need to follow. But if you remember, I've already said that 0.1% increase in carbon in soil is the equivalent of 9 tons per hectare. And if you think about the numbers I've just shown you, with that 3,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being emitted from that dairy farm, I can't do the maths in my head, but you don't need to increase carbon in soil a lot to balance that number off. And that's the point, really. And this really is just talking about the growing demand for offsets. And it's very much linked to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And that's the reason why we've got this rush to declare commitments to net zero, and also why we've got this so-called gold rush or Wild West, with businesses wanting to trade carbon as offsets, because those businesses who've made these commitments now need to make good on those commitments, and one way to do it is to buy an offset. But what's happening at the moment is these offsets are being bought probably instead of reducing emissions, rather than once they've done their best to reduce their emissions, and they're only left with those hard to get rid of emissions. And that's partly because most of these offsets are too cheap. So it's cheaper to buy an offset than it is to reduce your emissions. And if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we have to reduce emissions. We just have to reduce emissions. And that's back to really getting rid of our love affair with fossil fuels. And that just show you in the next slide, please, some of that. Yeah. So this is just some observations really that I've made at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. Yes, we've got to get large-scale carbon removal happening as quickly as we can. And these new marketplaces, they've got their place, and certainly most farmers are eyeing them up because it's another income stream, and it clearly is another income stream. I would say if you are eyeing up these markets, make sure you read the agreement, because they vary quite a lot between different buyers. And effectively, if you sign up to these, you will need to meet their requirements. And that does generally involve needing to verify your carbon status, and also that carbon needs to be there and permanently there. And that's one of the areas of real contention, is just how permanent is permanent. I mentioned earlier insetting, and actually where we can solve these issues of fairness within supply chains, it's a much better way to go. But I say that because at the moment, I don't think anybody can quite work out how to do this. And we do already have some businesses buying from farmers wanting to take ownership of the farm's carbon, but probably not really with adequate remuneration for it. The next one I've just asked about, should government be leading regulation in this area? At the moment, regulation is very slow to emerge, very slow. We've got a woodland carbon code, we've got a peatland carbon code, we haven't got a soil farmland carbon code. And that's mainly because already the market has gone and created a whole plethora of codes. But this last point is most important. Now, I've already kind of said it, that we've really got to focus on truly sustainable food systems. That's the point. And that means doing that rather than focusing on selling carbon. Because if we do that, we're going to do much better in terms of avoiding the worst of climate change. And my last slide, you'll be pleased to hear, is this one. And hopefully it sends you all away feeling very positive, because what it's illustrating is the potential for farmland to store carbon. That's the point. And you can see where we are in our latitude, we're very well placed to do that. And you know, that's the bit that I think farmers in the next 10, 20 years will be required to focus on whilst producing food, not instead of, whilst producing food, and it's perfectly possible. So Tom, I don't know if we've got any more questions.
Actually, yes, we do. We have quite a few questions and quite a few comments that have come in from various different people.
Oh dear, oh dear. Right, go for it.
So to start with, we've had a comment come in from your colleague, Becky, just to
well done, Becky.
you up on the age at first calving. So she said,
oh, thanks, Becky.
Age at first calving is important and will have an impact, as it is where she becomes productive, and this alongside number of lactations will be important. It's a balancing act of the two to ensure that they are in the herd as soon as possible, but also remain there for a large number of lactations.
Yeah.
So the first couple of years of emissions are balanced over a longer productive life. Absolutely,
and I think that's true of all livestock classes. The longer they stay in the herd or the flock, the better, because you're balancing off all those emissions, those embedded emissions, and getting them to first calving or first lambing. The other thing is them not dying too soon.
Absolutely.
So it's all the basics of good herd management.
So how much of improving of our carbon footprint can we put down to technical efficiencies on the farm?
A significant amount, I would say, because you've already seen with David, with the things I've been talking about with David, certainly with the feed and the fertilizer, reducing those emissions is I wouldn't like to say what percentage, but a significant contribution is made by improving technical efficiency in both those areas, because you'll be using less fertilizer for the same production and using less feed for the same production. So that will always reduce emissions. And then I think the technical actual productive efficiency, and I didn't mention this, the genetic efficiency of the cows also plays a large part, because you've got a more efficient animal, so they can partition energy better to production rather than needing to eat more simply to maintain themselves. And it's a shame in a way that we can't, I'm sure genomics will come up with a way of being able to measure that with gene markers, to be able to identify those animals that are better at partitioning food to production and maintenance.
I think the other thing, Tom, to remember with any of these doing in measurements, putting the data is it's over a 5-10 year average. It's no good just looking at an individual yearly basis, because there are so many factors that can affect your result on a yearly basis. So it's got to be over like a 5-year period to see a significant change, a statistical difference in a change.
Yeah, you're right, because I mean certainly farm footprints will vary from year to year just because of the weather. You know, they're bound to. You know, for instance, if you're an arable farmer, if your yield's down but you still put the same amount of product on, your footprint goes up. Yeah. So that's why it's so important that you do this year in, year out, and that you also kind of look at the physical factors that are going on, and potentially don't beat yourself up, because things will go up as well as down.
Yeah, I believe that's a red tractor rule, not just Darla. Now we have gone just over time by a minute, so we're 1 hour 1 minute in, and I think I'm going to take a liberty, because we've had so many good questions and comments come in. I'd like to keep going just for a few moments longer, if that's okay. So apologies to everybody if you've got things to do at 8 o'clock. This is being recorded. So soil tests, how often, which analysis should we be using?
Right, so how often depends why you've taken the soil test, really. If you're an arable farmer, I think, and you're taking soil tests to give you an indication of your soil health in order to think about what inputs you're going to apply, then you're probably testing it more frequently, every 3 years. If you're taking soil tests simply to look at soil carbon, there's probably no point in doing it any more frequently than every 5 years, simply because it takes time for soil carbon stocks to change. You might see a difference every year, but those tend to be more transient. So that would be my advice in terms of how frequently. What was the second part of that question? Sorry, I'm not retaining that information very well.
Which analysis should we be looking at?
Right. Well, different analytical companies will come up with different answers. So it's a little bit like your carbon calculator. You probably want to stick to the same one, especially if you're looking at carbon offsets. I would also say, though, that as a farmer, we need all of it. I include myself in this because I know I'm not brilliant at it, although I did go on a training course on soils. We need to be better at digging holes and knowing what we're looking at. So when we actually look at a soil profile, we get better at understanding what we're seeing when we're seeing compaction, when we're seeing good soil structure, and also looking at how the roots are going down through the soil, because actually soil function is every bit as important, and soil structure. And I would say that for dairy farms, especially as machinery's got heavier and you're forced to go on land when probably you'd be best steering clear of going on it at all, compaction has become a much bigger problem than it ever used to be. And that will affect your soil's ability both to function and produce good crops, as well as its ability to sequester carbon.
And if you want to know more about digging holes and how to get the most out of the information within that hole, then please have a look at our great soils resources on the AHDB website.
Oh, very good advert. Yeah.
So what are the risks associated with selling carbon credits?
I guess probably two. One is that you will sell them at a time, well, actually there's probably three. You'll sell them, and you can only sell that that credit once. So, you know, if, for instance, you've sold a credit that's moved your soil in a particular field from, I don't know, 3.5% organic matter or carbon to 3.7, you can't then go back to 3.5 again and sell it again 10 years later. So if you sold that too cheaply, then actually, you know, that's it. The second one is that the business who's actually purchased, well, there'll probably be a middleman in the middle, but the person who's purchasing it, you need to be very clear about what they require. So at the moment, some schemes are almost like they're wanting to tell a good story, and they don't necessarily want to move your carbon onto their balance sheet. But where they do want to move your carbon onto their balance sheet for net zero purposes, you have to make sure that you've actually carried out your side of the bargain. Because if you don't, then potentially, you know, you're in breach of the agreement, which is not great. And I guess the third one is down to what farming practice changes you have to make and how permanent they are to the future functioning of your farm. And by that, I'm probably talking more about where you've decided you're going to plant trees and they're going to be on that land for a long time. And effectively, that affects your land use for a generation to come. And you're committed to that, even if you sell the farm. So it's not something to be undertaken too lightly.
No.
Thank you. And obviously there are a lot of different calculators out there.
Yep.
For those people that aren't using one particular calculator already and are looking at going down this journey, how should they choose the calculator that they should be using?
You shouldn't be asking me that, Tom.
I mean,
well, I mean, yes. How should they choose? I think it really comes down, as Liz, two things there. One is that we're working with 8 of the significant calculators within the dairy roadmap to get some standardization, and that's a key factor as well. So that gives more trust in any of these main calculators. The other one is it's sometimes down to what help you can get with inputting the data, keeping it simple, understanding the people that you're dealing with, and in some cases, if your milk buyer might actually steer you in the direction of a calculator. I know some of the retailers want to use one calculator, and then some of the processors want to use another one. So it depends also whether you want to pay for one or whether it comes as part of the package that your processor might be supplying.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to that, really corroborating what you've just said, David, that I think what will happen in time is that the basic calculations will be the same, but then as somebody using a calculator, you'll better choose based on preference, really. What's easier to use? Where do you get the best backup service? Have they got a phone number you can ring that somebody will answer, you know, if you get stuck? And certainly we kind of pride ourselves on having somebody at the end of the phone who will answer the phone if you can't work out how to do it. And I think that and also somebody who understands what you're going through, which not all the calculators have that kind of, they're not so much rooted in practicality. And I think that at the end of the day, that's going to become more and more important. But they still got to do the basics right.
Yeah, the basic reporting has to be right, and that has to have some standards attached to it as well, and so, which a lot of them have got the standards attached, and they go with the internet IPCC standards and things there. So that's in place. But it's like any software; over time, the popularity will depend on the different companies, and it's entirely up to them how they make that work too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'd say at the moment, all the calculators, there's so much change going on in this area in terms of improving factors and also how those calculations are being done. I don't think there's ever been such a time of change to respond to industry needs and also to bring on new products to help farmers be able to choose those products they're using, which potentially have got lower emissions factors. And actually, something I would say is if you're concerned about footprint, you do need to think about where things like your fertilizers are even coming from. Because, for instance, nitrogen fertilizers from Eastern Europe have significantly higher emissions factors than those from Western Europe. And it's not just the transport, it's the production mechanism, and things like that you wouldn't know, would you?
No.
I think in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we've got so many great questions and comments coming in. I'm going to ask you both for your take-home messages based on demystifying carbon, but just whilst you've got a brief moment to think about your answer, I want to say a huge thank you and a massive apology to everybody that sent in questions that we have been unable to answer. It's been great to have that many questions come in tonight. So Liz, from your point of view, demystifying carbon, what are your take-home messages for the people
Okay.
who...
Well, just before that, Tom, I'm very happy to have a stab at answering the questions, so that if you've got a way of sending them out to people, I'm not sure if you do, because I've done that before. Yeah, okay, fine. In terms of the take-home message, I would say that if you haven't yet had a go at using any calculator, have a go, because it's the only way you're going to find out the scale of the challenge that your business is facing, really, in order to make a start on reducing emissions. You might get a pleasant surprise, I think I'd say, but really the areas I spoke about, the 3 Fs, feed, fertilizer and fuels, those are the ones that you can do most about as a dairy farmer.
Perfect. David, your take-home message, please.
I think it's a couple of things. One is the fact that, as Liz says, get a report done, because actually when you look at it, some of it you say, oh, so what, I can't make any difference there. But other factors in there you'll look at and say, or I've looked at as well and said, actually I can make a difference, and it's an area that I will target to make a difference. And I think that's important too. And I've been, encouraged with what Liz has explained tonight on just demystifying it a bit, because yes, there are calculations in behind, but actually we can only work with what we've got. The key thing, of course, is that we're still producing food, and we will keep producing food. And I think that's equally important to remember, is that our main job is to be efficient businesses, and whatever we do, the more efficient we are, the lower our carbon footprint is.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So with that, all that's left to do really is say thank you very much, Liz, for speaking today. Thank you for James for working so hard in the background, but an even bigger thank you to you, David, particularly for being so open over the last few years as your tenure as a strategic farm. And as I said before, if you want any more information on what the work is that we've done with David in the past, then please have a look at our website. Thank you all very much for attending tonight. Thank you for all the great questions. Hopefully see you at a live event fairly soon. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Good evening. Goodbye.